Mesdames et messieurs, je vous souhaite une bienvenue chaleureuse à ce dîner-conférence de l'Institut Macdonald-Laurier sur l'importance géostratégique des ressources énergétiques du Canada. Merci d'être des nôtres. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our special panel event that will explore fueling prosperity and global security, why the world needs Canada to unleash its energy resources. Thank you so much for coming. Now, before I say a few words on the theme of this event, I wanted to beg your indulgence to say just a couple of words about the Macdonald-Laurier Institute itself, an organization that was founded 10 years ago, and I'm pleased to say that, yes, this is our 10th anniversary year, and anybody who wants the 10th anniversary lapel pin, we can probably find one for you. Since we were established, MLI has been recognized repeatedly as the leading think tank in Ottawa and one of the 5 top think tanks in the country. We've been recognized internationally with awards for our projects. We've achieved an impressive national media profile. We are a full-service public policy think tank with major programs in Indigenous affairs, foreign affairs, defense and national security, and domestic issues, and we hold frequent events, just like the one here today. On that note, I'm glad to say that this event has attracted representation from the Commons, the Senate, Global Affairs, Natural Resources Canada, the Business Council of Canada, the Mining Association of Canada, and many diplomatic missions in Ottawa, including Japan, Belgium, India, Poland, Estonia, Indonesia, Germany, and Romania, as well as representatives of the energy industry and the national media. Why are you all here? Why are you all here? Because whether Canadians are aware of it or not, Canada is a formidable energy power with the potential to do far more. We enjoy the status of having officially the world's 3rd largest reserves of oil, and unofficially we're even larger than that, and we are the 5th largest producer of natural gas. Despite these advantages, Canada has so far been unable to get its energy exports to global markets, including in the Indo-Pacific and Europe. I'm, of course, leaving aside the United States, which we enjoy tremendous success in getting our resources to. Canadians' understanding of the importance of natural resources to the national economy is surprisingly unsophisticated. Nothing has contributed more than natural resources to buttressing Canada's middle class against the rapidly changing global economy of the 21st century. And since wealth creation and capital investment are any society's capacity for innovation, for resilience, and for adaptation, developing our resources is an indispensable contribution to our ability to combat climate change. Economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities is also part of the future of Canada's energy industry. Indigenous communities' willingness to embrace oil and gas projects could be the difference between the success and failure of these projects, as the continuing controversy over Coastal GasLink shows. Equally relevant is the geopolitical significance of our energy supplies. In the Indo-Pacific, countries like Japan and Taiwan often rely on Middle East exports that must travel through international chokepoints, such as the straits of Hormuz and Malacca. Meanwhile, our European allies are in danger of becoming dependent on gas supplies from Vladimir Putin's Russia, a country that has not been shy about shutting off supplies or inflating prices for political or economic gain. Canada has an opportunity to be a safe and reliable source of oil and gas for our key friends and allies around the world. By building pipelines and expanding oil and gas exports, Canadians can secure their own prosperity, promote Indigenous reconciliation, and help their allies overseas. To shed light on these issues, MLI has brought together leading thinkers to discuss how Canada can build its energy advantage. We're going to have, first of all, a keynote talk, and I will introduce our speaker in a moment. That will be followed by a panel moderated by Ken Coates. So after our keynote speaker has had a chance to have his say, I will come back up on the podium and introduce Ken, who will then bring the panel up on the podium. So ladies and gentlemen, let me please introduce our keynote speaker today, Steve Loud. He is the Executive Vice Chairman, Canadian Natural. Steve has had a distinguished career, I think it's fair to say, in the oil and gas industry and many other areas as well. And we've had the privilege of having Steve come in to tell us a little bit about what he has learned as a result of his important position in the oil and gas industry about the geostrategic significance of Canada's energy resources. Steve, I wonder if I could ask you to come to the podium.
So thank you, Brian, and thanks for that introduction. Maybe before I get started, I'll tell you just a brief snippet about Canadian Natural, because a lot of people don't know too much about us. We tend to fly under the radar. We started out 30 years ago. We probably had about 400 barrels a day equivalent of production. Today, 30 years later, we are the largest oil and gas producer in Canada, about 1.2 million BOEs a day. So we've seen tremendous growth. It's been quite a ride. I think we had 6 employees back 30 years ago. We have 10,000 people today, and we employ directly or indirectly about 90,000 people every year. So we're a big part of the energy industry in Canada. We have natural gas. We're the largest producer. We have heavy oil, largest producer. Light oil, significant part of that. Thermal oil. And we're also the largest oil sands mining and upgrading producer in Canada. So we cross the whole spectrum of the energy business. So I'd like to thank Macdonald-Laurier Institute for having us come here today and talk to you about these important messages. I'd also like to thank Macdonald-Laurier Institute for the very important work they do and their contributions to public policy here in Canada. It's very important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the critical nature of the energy and the oil and gas business and climate change in Canada. It's critical to the prosperity and health of Canada, as well as the security in the world, as Brian talked. So, as always, the lawyers make me put this here, so I won't read it, but you can, there'll be a test at the end. Not so fast. Yeah, reporting disclosures is out there for you too, so we won't have a test on that. So let me talk about energy and climate change. And I suspect some of you might be thinking, an oil and gas guy talking about climate change, probably not going to be that positive. That's the common perception. It's reinforced by the oil and gas sector's detractors and constantly replayed in social media and the mainstream media. The common belief is oil and gas will come out negative on climate change. Perception and reality could not be farther apart. Today, I have a very positive story on climate change and a huge opportunity for Canada and the oil and gas sector, and how Canada can make a significant difference in the world. This is unique, and it's unprecedented leadership opportunity for Canada. An opportunity that I'm very excited about, an opportunity that Canada must not miss. The opportunity has been created by Canadian oil and gas sector's ability to leverage technology, innovate, and most importantly, Canadian ingenuity. And we created tremendous economic and environmental value. And we have delivered a very impressive Canadian success story. Because when it comes to environmental performance, Canadian Natural, and indeed the entire Canadian oil and gas sector, has delivered game-changing environmental performance. Canada's oil and gas sector recognized the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we have delivered impressive results. Essentially, Canada's oil and gas sector has taken what was branded as high-intensity oil in 2009, a lot of people called it dirty oil, and it made it what I would call the premium oil on the global stage. And we've done all that in 10 years. And the Canadian oil and gas sector is committed to do even better in the future, and I'll talk about that. Canada's oil and gas sector ability to deliver game-changing environmental performance has created a tremendous opportunity for Canada. And it really hinges around Canada taking a global perspective on climate change. By embracing the opportunity that a global perspective creates and unlocking the power of a global perspective, Canada can be a world leader when it comes to climate change. After all, climate change is a global issue, not just a Canadian issue. Unlocking the power of a global perspective allows Canada to make a significant contribution and impact, positive impact, on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. It reduces global poverty, unleashes Canadian ingenuity, supports economic and environmental balance, creates a massive amount of well-paying jobs, and supports investment in a low-carbon energy mix, nation builds, and makes the world and Canada a better place. And Canada will become a world leader in climate change. We can drive an almost virtuous cycle of economic, environmental, and social performance, and at the same time make Canada a stronger, more cohesive nation. The opportunity for Canada to make a significant impact on climate change, reduce global poverty, and at the same time create hundreds of thousands of jobs across Canada is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But first, let me step back here a bit and take a look at the big picture. The world needs energy, and it needs lots of energy, and all types of energy. It needs renewables, it needs oil and gas, it needs nuclear, it needs biomass, and it needs hydro. As I'll show you here today, the world needs Canada's energy more now than ever. Population growth will drive increased consumption. The middle class is growing, which is a good thing, and that drives energy consumption. We also need to get a very large portion of the world's population out of poverty. And as this UN chart shows, to achieve better standards of living or human outcomes requires more energy. Energy that is affordable and readily available. Another way to look at it, human development is fueled by energy. Now, Canada and the rest of the West, which has about 1.4 billion people, or 20% of the world's population in the world today, has the longest life expectancy, the highest level of education, and the lowest rate of air pollution deaths. And of course, we use the most energy. There's a strong correlation. The West uses the equivalent, and since I'm an oil and gas guy, I will use barrels of oil equivalent, about 34 barrels per year per person of all types of energy, hydro, everything. Roughly half the world's population uses less than 4 barrels per year per person. If that half of the population were able to access affordable energy and lift themselves out of poverty to levels sort of the same as the second quartile, which includes China, Turkey, Mexico, and Brazil, the world would need 27% more energy. And those countries in that second quartile, China, Mexico, were to go only halfway to the levels the West enjoys today. Combined, we'd need 53% more energy. So the world needs energy, and it needs lots of energy, and all types of energy, and it needs to be affordable. The top 6 goals for the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals are poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, and clean water. Affordable clean energy is ranked 7th and has a big impact on the ability to achieve the top 6 goals, as does climate change, which is ranked 13th. Just as an aside, there are parts of the world that collect dung, mostly women and girls, to provide the energy they need. Providing affordable oil and natural gas allows these girls to go to school and the women to participate in higher value work. Affordable energy impacts gender equality as well. So if we take a look at the International Energy Agency's forecasted supply and demand, they have developed 3 scenarios. The first is a stated policy scenario, which has greenhouse gas emissions stabilizing. There's a sustainable scenario, which has greenhouse gas emissions dropping dramatically, that red line. And the current policy scenario, which sees greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. In all these cases, the strong demand for natural gas and the substantial demand for oil, within 2040, oil demand at 65 million barrels a day in the sustainable scenario. Renewable energy goes up significantly, and natural gas actually increases by 13% because it's the lowest carbon energy fossil fuel. Surprisingly, from a climate change perspective, coal is still hanging in there. Why? Because coal is affordable. It's an affordable alternative. And the world needs affordable energy. In fact, in 2017, and I believe in 2018 as well, coal consumption in the world actually grew by 1.7%. Oil and gas consumption has also grown in 17 and 18 because oil and gas are also affordable. Now, if we take a look at the December 2018 Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Committee, or the IPCC, report highlighting the need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This is the same report that all the media reported that we had to get off oil and gas or all hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, or the world was going to come to an end. Has a medium scenario for total energy demand being roughly flat. And it has a massive ramp up for energy supplied from renewables, about 2.5 times what we have today by 2040. Nuclear, it's got to be 1.9 times by 2040, so big, big ramp ups. Interestingly, natural gas fares pretty well, 80% of today's levels. And the IPCC report has oil dropping by a factor of about 0.69 in 2040. That still meets the 1.5 degree scenario, by the way. Roughly 70 million barrels a day by 2040, even though the media reported we had to get off all fossil fuels. And surprisingly, coal is still utilized at 25% by 2040. So both the UN and the IPCC, or IEA, forecasts project total energy demand to be flat. This means the world is going to have to become significantly more energy efficient, which will happen, but unlikely to the levels needed. So energy demand is likely going to go up. At least I hope it goes up. Otherwise, half the world's population using 4 barrels or less will not see their standard of living increase. Something most, if not all Canadians, would say is not acceptable. If we assume 50% of that growth comes from efficiency and the remainder comes from renewables and nuclear alone, renewables have to grow by 3.5 times what we have today, and nuclear by 2.8 times. So even in the stringent 1.5 degree scenario from the UN, oil and natural gas are a significant part of the future. Who supplies that oil and natural gas should be the lowest greenhouse gas emissions intensity and have the highest standards. Now, natural gas is a big feedstock for petrochemicals, but what many people don't realize is that about 25% of every barrel of oil produced is not used for fuel. It's used for pharmaceuticals, eyeglasses, plastics, tires, and a host of thousands of other products that are essential to our daily lives. In fact, this part of oil demand is growing the fastest. We need oil and natural gas for more than just energy. So the world needs energy, and it needs lots of energy. Because of its affordability, natural gas is going to be an even bigger share. However, oil share will still be significant. And if the world is to help millions of people get out of poverty and successfully address climate change, who should supply that oil and natural gas? As I said earlier, should be those who can produce it at the highest standards, lowest greenhouse gas emission intensities, and the lowest cost. Which brings me to the great Canadian success story, one the entire oil and gas sector has achieved and has room to do even more. A success story I believe everyone in Canada should be proud of. I know I am. Canada's oil and gas sector recognized the need to do something about greenhouse gas emissions, and we've been able to leverage technology and Canadian ingenuity, delivering impressive results. Canadian Natural ourselves have invested $3.4 billion in R&D since 2009. Essentially, Canada's oil and gas sector has taken what was branded as high-intensity oil in 2009 and made what I would call the premium oil on the global stage today. All in 10 years, and the Canadian oil and gas sector is committed to do even better in the future. For instance, at Canadian Natural's oil sands mining and upgrading operations, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 37%. At today's production levels, that's equivalent to taking 665,000 cars off the road. In our primary heavy oil operations, through technology and continuous improvement, we've reduced our methane volumes by 78%. That's equivalent to taking 930,000 cars off the road. Canadian Natural is also a leader in carbon capture and sequestration, and we're the largest capturer of CO2 in Canada. What we do today is equivalent to taking 576,000 cars off the road. So just with these three projects, Canadian Natural alone has taken over 2 million cars off the road, equivalent. That's equivalent to 5% of the entire fleet in Canada. And this is just what Canadian Natural has done alone. The entire industry has achieved similar, equally impressive results. Canadian ingenuity and our ability to innovate and leverage technology has taken what was very high-intensity oil on a wells-to-combustion basis in 2009, that far right blue bar, to levels at or below the average in the green bars. That's an impressive Canadian success story. It's not 2009 anymore. And this is the basis or the root cause that has generated this tremendous opportunity for Canada. And the success story is just getting started. We can, with new projects, leverage technology and Canadian ingenuity to do even better, with Canadian Natural's goal of reaching net zero emissions. Canadian Natural's oil and gas sector has had a significant positive impact on greenhouse gas intensity, and we can make a huge impact on global emissions as well. And this is an immense opportunity for Canada. For instance, if the rest of the world achieved what Canadian oil and gas industry has in terms of flaring alone, then greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 23%. That's equivalent to taking 110 million cars off the road. Put that in perspective, that's more than 3 times the number of vehicles on the road today in Canada. 3 times. Canada is obviously leading the world. The one LNG plant Canada has approved, when on stream, is the equivalent to taking 40 coal-fired plants offline, or the equivalent to reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 10%, or greater than BC's total emissions. We have the capacity here in Canada to build at least 5 of these LNG plants, which would be equivalent to reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. 50% is a big number, and this is a big opportunity. Yes, it's true, as the naysayers will say. If we produce more oil and gas in Canada, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions will go up. What is also true, and much more important, is that global greenhouse gas emissions will go down, and they will go down significantly. In reality, not getting Canadian oil and gas onto the global market will increase global greenhouse gas emissions. Taking a global perspective is a tremendous opportunity for Canada to make a huge positive impact on global climate change. If you view these facts from a global perspective, it's very clear that delivering Canada's oil and natural gas to global markets should be a climate change and economic priority for Canada. It needs to be an economic priority because delivering Canada's oil and gas to global markets generates a massive number of high-paying jobs for Canadians. Of course, the one-time jobs to build the one LNG plant and the 3 oil pipelines proposed to get Canadian oil and gas to global markets is very high, close to 900,000 person-years of work. Even more important are the long-term jobs needed to run and develop the oil and gas required to keep these facilities full. As you can see, the oil and gas sector employs roughly the same number of people as Canada's auto sector. Putting that in perspective, these long-term jobs are equivalent to growing Canada's auto sector by roughly 20%. If we could grow the auto sector in Canada by 20%, this would be a national priority, as getting market access for Canada's oil and gas should be. Equally important are the government revenues generated from this activity, which are very, very significant. Having a very strong Canadian economy is critical to effectively transition to a lower carbon energy supply. Transitioning to renewables does not come for free. The economy needs to be strong for that to happen. Now, the 528,000 jobs the oil and gas industry creates are across Canada, with significant jobs in Ontario and Quebec actually being larger than in that of BC and Saskatchewan. And the 23,000 jobs the oil and gas sector creates in the Maritimes, thanks to fly in, fly out, makes a tremendous positive economic and social impact on the Maritimes. A strong and growing oil and gas sector is good for Canada, all of Canada. The oil and gas sector already has many partnerships with Indigenous companies. Canadian Natural alone did $500 million of work with Indigenous companies in 2018. And in the last 3 years, we've done $1.2 billion, and that continues to grow. I know of no other industrial sector that has such meaningful Indigenous economic participation. If we unlock this opportunity, Indigenous people will be able to participate in the economic growth more so than ever before. A strong and growing oil and gas sector is good for the Indigenous people and good for Canada. Driven by the oil and gas sector's game-changing environmental performance, Canada has a unique leadership opportunity to take a global perspective and drive both improved global climate change and the Canadian economy. The Canadian oil and gas sector has delivered an impressive success story. Canadian ingenuity has leveraged technology and continuous improvement to deliver game-changing environmental performance. If the world delivered oil at the same environmental performance of Canada on flaring alone, it'd be equivalent to taking 3 times the vehicles in Canada off the road. And just one LNG plant would reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 10%. The success story has many chapters that are ready to unfold, where we can continue to leverage technology and Canadian ingenuity, driving even greater environmental performance, grow the economy, and create thousands of jobs. And at the same time, we can improve social performance and build a nation, as it becomes more apparent that we can deliver impressive global climate change performance and grow the economy where all regions in Canada participate. The leadership opportunity for Canada is here today. Unlocking the power of a global perspective, we can make a significant positive impact on global greenhouse gas emissions, reduce global poverty, unleashes Canadian ingenuity, driving both environmental and economic performance, creating jobs, and supporting investment in a lower carbon future while strengthening the nation. Canada has an immense opportunity to become a world leader and make not only Canada, but the world a better place. This opportunity, as I said earlier, is driven by Canadian ingenuity, our ability to leverage technology and innovate and deliver game-changing environmental performance. And we're just getting started. We can deliver even better performance and create thousands of jobs, all while delivering world-leading social and governance performance. So what I ask of you today is to take a global perspective. Climate change is a global issue, not just a national issue. Reflect about the facts I have presented here today, and then advocate for the environment, for the oil and gas sector, market access, and First Nations, and for Canada. Together, we can create hundreds of thousands of jobs for Canadians and make the world a better place. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Let's not miss it. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That was fascinating and detailed and insightful talk about the future of the oil and gas and the energy sector more generally in Canada, the challenges that are ahead of us, and we're going to explore all of that in the panel which is going to follow. And for that, I am going to invite to come to the podium the moderator of that panel, Ken Coates. By the way, Steve will be part of the panel, and therefore you will have a chance to ask Steve questions as well as other members of the panel once we've had a chance to let everybody have their say. So Ken Coates, well, Ken, he's Monk Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's the head of our Indigenous program. He is the Canada Research Chair in Regional Innovation at the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. And because he is a Renaissance man, Ken is also the former head of the Japan Studies Association of Canada with a long-standing interest in the Indo-Pacific and Canada's place there. And Ken is also a very dear friend of mine. Ken, would you like to come to the podium, please?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Steve. We want to get to our panel sort of very, very quickly. So a couple of opening comments, then I'll ask our panelists to come and sit up, and we'll get going here as quickly as possible. It's fascinating to hear that great presentation on what Canada's done, and then read the newspaper. You would not believe we were talking about the same thing, and that's not to suggest you got it wrong, although I would suggest that Canada's getting it wrong in a variety of ways. Let me speak just really, really quickly to the question of sort of Indigenous participation in this issue and in the Canadian economy sort of generally. Right now, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding of what's going on. Independent of what we're seeing with protests and rail blockades, I would happily describe the oil and gas sector as the front lines of reconciliation in Canada. There is no place in the Canadian economy where Indigenous people are more heavily involved, more constructively involved, and where they have attached their future as communities and as populations to the opportunities that sort of lie ahead. And again, you contrast that to what we hear about the kind of opportunities and situations that sort of go forward. But think of this. Who would have thought 10 years ago, first off, that the government of Canada would buy a pipeline? That would have not likely. But having bought the pipeline, who would have thought that the major sort of people lining up to buy it are a group of First Nations from Western Canada? That in Project Reconciliation, and several other proposals, by the way, there's at least 3 major Indigenous proposals to buy the pipeline and operate it themselves, in whole or in part. We have to look at the finances and all that sort of stuff. Just remember, we sort of look at that and say, oh yeah, you're all nodding your head saying, yeah, that's true. 10 years ago, who would have thought that was even part of the conversation? Guarantee you, nobody. Now it's actually aggressively discussed out in Western Canada in a major sort of way. Who would have thought also that when you talk about the LNG Canada project being proposed near Kitimat, British Columbia, that the strongest offender, even stronger in some ways than the corporations involved, are actually the Haisla First Nation, who have essentially attached their future as a people to the success of this venture. And if you go and talk to them and you think, well, are you huge fans of the oil and gas sector? I'm sure Haisla would say, if you could create a perfect world where we get energy magically out of the sky and we have no other way of producing it, they'd probably say, yeah, we'd rather have nothing happen. But their agenda is very simple. They want to get involved in the LNG Canada project because it will actually give them independence and autonomy. It's a phrase we don't hear very often. We should hear it far more. About the goal and objective of the Haisla First Nation is what they call own source revenue. What's really fascinating when you go out west and you say, why are you interested? Where does Project Reconciliation come from? Where do you get not 1 or 2, but on the Coastal GasLink project, 20 communities signing on and saying they're in favor of this? Across Western Canada, dozens and dozens of First Nations along all the pipeline routes. If you look at the Frontier Tech Resources Frontier Mine, the situation there is that there's all the First Nations and Métis communities in the area have signed on. They're pushing for changes and wanting improvements in the arrangement. But again, absolutely remarkable. Why? Because they want to break welfare dependency. This is the part that really intrigues me. When you go and say, why are you doing this? Jobs, economic opportunity, revenues for our government so we don't have to go to Ottawa and ask for and apply for and report on all the money sort of coming down the line. And the interesting thing, I do work in this area and spent a lot of time. I was in Calgary yesterday with a group of 10 people working on an Indigenous project. They're asking for advice on sort of policy issues. An Indigenous project is going to build about a $47 billion project that they're sort of proposing for Western Canada to actually get our energy resources to market. It's a project most of you have never heard of, but they're sincere about it. I think anybody that spent $70 million to this point just doing the exploratory work really believes this is important. And important partly because of what you said here, Steve, in terms of the opportunities, but even more substantially because what it means for First Nations in terms of their economic well-being, their sharing in prosperity. The front lines of reconciliation. Am I doing this to the edge? That was my big entrance. I was going to do that in a very dramatic way and tumble onto the floor. So this whole field is one full of misunderstandings, misapprehensions, misrepresentations in a whole bunch of different ways. And our goal here today is to clear some of those up, to make a series of observations about the kind of world that we see coming forward, but also to sort of give you a chance to ask your questions and see where things are going. So I would like to invite the other panelists to come to the front here and to join us on the podium. Steve, you have to come back up. No dinner yet, or no lunch yet. All of you come up. It's great. I'm doing everything wrong.
No, you're okay.
Okay, I'm all right. Good. So just really quickly explain the format. I'm going to ask everybody. Steve's already had his day in the sunlight. So we're going to ask the other three to give a sort of a brief introduction, about a 5-minute presentation on how they see this issue, the issue of fueling prosperity and global security from their perspective. They'll each give us sort of a short presentation or talk, and then we're actually going to turn it over to a series of questions that I get to moderate. So behave yourselves, please. We don't want questions from me. I'm going to direct the questions to one speaker at a time. I invite you all to sort of jump in after those questions if you want to add anything. Don't feel obliged, but if you've got something to contribute, that'd be absolutely wonderful. We will end that part of the process at about 1:30. So we've budgeted half an hour of time for questions from the floor. I have been at these events where the half-hour time budget was used up in the first question by the questioner. So we appreciate if you didn't do that and had sort of a short statement and a question directed at any of the panelists or the panelists as a whole. So we've put together a wonderful panel for your education and enjoyment sort of this afternoon. You've already met Steve and had the benefit of his presentation. Lisa Rayet is the Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking of CIBC Capital Markets, former Deputy Leader of the Conservative Opposition in Ottawa, and a former Minister of Natural Resources at the early part of your sort of cabinet operation. Jeff Kocharski is sitting right next to her. He has a wonderful resume that would take half an hour to read on his international experience, working with federal and provincial governments, working largely on energy-related issues and engagements with Asia. He's working with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on Canada's contribution to global energy security, so picking up on one of the many themes that Steve presented us, and he's an adjunct professor at Royal Roads. Jonathan Miller, sitting down at the end, also a senior fellow and deputy director at the Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a wonderfully well-known and well-published specialist in international affairs and Canadian and Asia relations. He also holds appointments as well as a senior fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. So these are the people you want to talk to and hear from and ask questions to, so we'll proceed fairly quickly with that. And if it's okay, Lisa, I'll ask you to go first.
Sure, my pleasure, and I will be short, or I'll be brief. Jim Flaherty used to say, I'm always short, but I will be brief this time. There are two fundamental truisms, I think, that I got out of your talk today, Steve, that have to be repeated over and over again in my mind. And that first one is this, that the world is going to need more energy. I think that's a truism. I think the second one that I get is the fact that development of oil and gas resources, natural resources, lifts people out of poverty. And I'm reminded by an article this morning in the Globe and Mail, National Post, Derek Burney wrote a piece, and he reminded me of what is carved into the entrance to the Peace Tower, and that is, where there is no vision, the people perish. And that's the part that I worry about the most, that while we get caught up in communicating about our current issues very regionally, locally, sometimes municipally, we also have to think about the grander vision for the country. So I'm very pleased to see all the statistics that you put up there today, Stephen. And I'm really happy to allow myself to understand it in a way that is meaningful to me. How many cars on the road? I live in Toronto or outside of Toronto. I see cars on the road every single day. That 401 is locked up, and I wish I could wish away a lot of those cars at any given time, and the good work of understanding what it means at emissions. With those two truisms, I think there are three things that we can be aware of and be prepared for. The first is cleaner use of coal and oil. The fundamental reality is we're still going to use those two, and Canada has done a remarkable job of investing in areas to clean it up. I would point to carbon capture and sequestration at Quest. My former government invested heavily in it, and I know that you have done a remarkable job in ensuring that that technology can be utilized around the world. And in fact, if it was used in China, it would be of great effect and impact. The second thing, we have to recognize that in order to meet emissions criteria, the world is going to convert to gas. And in fact, China is on a tear to convert from coal to gas. And that's why a project like in Mozambique gets so much attention, because the opportunity for the ability of providing liquefied natural gas to a very hungry economy in China is one that will allow for the thought of investing $55 billion in an oil field off the coast. That's something that gets my attention. And the last has to do with renewables, where I really think is the sweet spot of Canada. I joined CIBC 3 weeks ago, very new to the job, by the way. I'm still trying to figure out what it is I actually do, but this is my comfort zone. Standing and talking is easy. I get that part. It's the other parts that I have to get used to. But the renewables is so important. That's why when I took a look at CIBC and I looked at what the president of CIBC, Victor Dodig, is talking about in terms of these things, he talked about $150 billion that our bank is going to be putting towards sustainable finance by 2027. I mean, that's significant. And that's a recognition of the fact that we have to get there by renewables. But I want to caution you on one thing about renewables. Renewables involve mining. Renewables involve mining. The infrastructure associated with renewables involve nickel and copper. Yes, we all know about lithium. We know about rare earth elements. But there's a lot of other stuff that we're going to have to be able to access in order to make that conversion into renewables and to move ahead. So those are the three things that I think about most. And those are the things that I think on a global perspective are things that we should consider as we move forward, because we don't want to be left behind. Our vision should be about making sure that despite the fact that we are heavily blessed with oil and gas, the reality is we are transitioning out of oil and gas. That's a world decision. That's a positive decision. But we also have to be ready for the transition. I'd say one last thing, if I may, before you give me the hook. I grew up in Cape Breton Island, and I grew up there in the late 80s. And in the late 80s, Cape Bretoners lost the steel plant, they lost the coal plant, the coal mines, they lost the cod fishery. And we've never recovered from any of those things. That, my friends, was a very quick transition. And the impact was felt by the people who lived there. And to this day, it's felt by the people that live there. Your children do not have the option to stay at home. Your children know from an early age they have to leave. That cannot be Canada's story. Don't force a transition on ourselves without thinking about the grander vision for the world. So that's it.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Delightful. Jeff, to you.
I'm sorry.
Be careful with the podium. It has a tendency to migrate here.
I got a few notes, so it's easier for me to use this. Well, thanks very much. I want to say thank you very much to Macdonald-Laurier Institute for inviting me here, and it's a privilege to speak to all of you today. I came from Victoria yesterday. I'm sorry to tell you it was green, sunny, and warm. There's no snow, and it's been a while since I felt those sort of pins and needles on my skin as I walked over from Bywood Market, but it is great. I grew up in Edmonton, so I know what it's like. So I'm working on some research and publishing a paper in the next while through Macdonald-Laurier on energy in the Indo-Pacific. And so I want to just make a few points that I will be talking in more depth in that paper. what I'd like to say, and my focus here is going to be less global and more focused on the Indo-Pacific, energy and policy. That's my experience, that's my interest, that's what I'm doing work in. And so Canada must have a strategy in place to engage with the fastest growing, economically dynamic and most populous region in the world, and that's the Indo-Pacific. As long as we get the regulatory approvals in place and the process is respected and projects like LNG Canada and the Trans Mountain Pipeline are completed, Canada will, within the next 5 years, have significant crude oil and natural gas, or LNG, export capacity, which can be directed to the Indo-Pacific. As China, India, and the other countries in the region continue to modernize, as you've already heard, demand for energy there is growing rapidly. But there are also some risks in the region. It's a kind of unstable time. And so we've got geopolitical tensions, we've got competition for resources and influence going on in that region, and these things threaten the long-term stability of this important region. So the global order is being challenged by a range of competing political, economic, technological forces. Canada has a deep stake in the security and stability of that region. We already have about $173 billion of trade flowing between Canada to the Indo-Pacific through the East and South China Seas. So it's not inconsequential, our stakes there. And for the future, it's the fastest growing region. That's where majority of Canada's trade and our future is going to be as well. So to summarize a few key points I just want to make, Canada's energy resources have not been accorded the importance and the value they deserve. And they haven't been the strategic benefits of Canada's resources and the benefits they can generate have not been recognized, because energy is a strategic issue and not simply a matter of trade. Canada needs to recognize this and use the strategic leverage associated with our energy resources to gain broader benefits, whether they're diplomatic or trade-related or environmental. There's many, many benefits that we can get using energy in Asia, because there are many countries there that are highly dependent on crude oil and natural gas, which will still be in demand, as we've seen, for a few decades to come. And Canada is in a unique position to take advantage of that. We should also be developing a strategic energy resources strategy in this country within an overall Indo-Pacific strategy, which I understand Global Affairs has started working on and hopefully will be complete at some point this year. So energy and security go hand in hand, and Canada should use its energy resources to support our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and enhance energy security in the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Jonathan?
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. And similar to Jeff, my background is a bit on the Indo-Pacific, so I'm going to focus a little bit on that. In fact, I just returned yesterday from the Indo-Pacific, so I was in Tokyo and returned last night. So I'm technically on Tokyo time, so if I was still there, I'd be finishing my workday and probably having a beer, but I'm very happy to be here with you all. I just want to make 3 quick points, and as I said, kind of focus a little bit on some of the security issues that are happening in the region and why this makes some of the decisions that we've kind of been talking about earlier today so important. The first one, and this is a message that I hear constantly when I'm in the region, is that while Canada hasn't always been up to snuff in the region, and I think some countries in the region demand more of Canada, Canada is a trusted partner. And I think that there's a demand, whether it's from the traditional security side, whether it's from the trade and investment side, or whether it's from the topic that we're talking about here today on energy issues, there's a demand for more Canada. So I think this is the kind of covering point to kind of put in. The second element, and Lisa, I think, had some really good points, but I would like to say when it comes to how we look at Asia, and this will be true on the energy security side as well, is that it does not begin and end with the Chinese market. So yes, there has been some economic challenges in the Asia-Pacific recently, or the Indo-Pacific, however you frame it, but some of the world's top 20 economies, we have Japan, we have South Korea, we have Indonesia, and in addition to the G20 countries, we have a number of other growing countries that Canada is interested from an energy market. We have Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. So there's a lot of economic opportunity in the region. That being said, and I think this kind of gets the crux of what I wanted to talk about, is that the region, unfortunately, and Jeff alluded to this, I think Ken alluded to this, Brian alluded to this in his opening remarks, is that the region is has some very tense and acute challenges right now in the security realm. So if you look in particular on the maritime realm, we see in the East China Sea, Japan has a territorial dispute with China. In the South China Sea, China has a territorial dispute with almost everyone and claims a large swath of maritime space. But also we see in the Middle East, and increasingly this has come to attention and to mind due to some of the tensions between the US and Iran. But I would reference, and this is important with some of our key partners in the Indo-Pacific, this is not something that has just been an issue of the past year or two. In fact, Japan and South Korea also invested millions of dollars in a counter-piracy mission over the past 10 years in order to protect some of their maritime vessels. We're seeing this similar outpouring of funds and diplomatic capital from both sides now to protect their commercial vessels that are under threat in the Strait of Hormuz and elsewhere. So when these countries look at some of their security in the region, and just to kind of give you a snapshot of how much this dependence is, I've just kind of given you I'll give you some statistics from two partners that we can look at in the Indo-Pacific, and two very key partners, one being South Korea, as I referenced, and the second being Japan. So if you think from the crude oil perspective, these are the statistics of where South Korea gets its oil. Saudi Arabia, 29%. Kuwait, 15%. Iran, this is before the waivers, 12%. Iraq, 12%. United Arab Emirates, 8%. Qatar, 5%. And Russia, 5%. The story is very similar for Japan. So these are the sources, most of them are authoritarian governments, the region completely awash with challenges. In addition to the maritime choke points that we have, there is a need and a desire for sustainable, diverse option, and Canada, I think, can provide that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that. So I've got a series of questions I'm going to pose to you, and after I'm going to direct it to one person to speak, and if you want to follow up afterwards, please just jump in. And since I'm now very nervous that Jonathan's going to fall asleep, as travel consequences sort of, I'll ask you the first one, Jonathan. What role does Canada play in the current pursuit of a global energy security regime? Are we really highly favored? Are we looked on with great respect and enthusiasm? What role do we currently play? And what could we be doing? I mean, you said we have a role. What does that mean in terms of actual practical on-the-ground trade, investment, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think a lot of states, I mean, this is not just in the Indo-Pacific, I think elsewhere have recognized that opportunity. And in fact, there's been significant investments, whether it's in LNG Canada or elsewhere, to look to untap that potential. So I think there's that element there. But what one thing when I was thinking about this, and the question you kind of, I was wanting to reference this point in my talks, but when we talk about energy security, I think the word gets kind of bandied about a lot. Geopolitics, another word that kind of gets bandied about a lot. I look to the International Energy Agency and to find their definition of energy security. And I think it's informative when thinking about your question on Canada. So the International Energy Agency says energy security is the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. So when I think about that, immediately I think about the Canadian option. But I think I'd like to, I don't have the ability to change their definitions, but I think I'd like to add one additional word to that definition, which I think is important and very much shows where Canada's role could be, and that is sustainable. So not only is it having the uninterrupted availability, which is some of the things that I referenced on the choke points and the difficulties of the security situation in the region, but it's having sustainable and affordable alternative. And I think that's the role that Canada has that is different from whether it be the Gulf states or Russia or other options.
Super. Anybody else want to add anything on that one? We'll go on, Lisa. Oh,
Just real quick,
Sorry,
really
thanks.
good point on definitions, and actually the definition provided by the IEA is a pretty simple one, and a lot of others have actually made that same suggestion, putting sustainability in. And we should remember that the word sustainability applies equally to as much as to economic sustainability as to environmental.
great. Thanks very much. So Lisa, to you. What happens if we don't get this right? What are the economic and sort of strategic consequences for Canada if we don't respond to the opportunity? What does it mean? You like this business of cars on the 401. Yeah. I think for all the rest of us who don't live in Toronto, it is the single goofiest thing about Canada, the traffic that's there and the implications of that. What happens to Canada if we don't get this right?
Well, I'm not going to be, I am an optimist, not a pessimist by nature. I have to be. I'm from Cape Breton Island, for goodness sake. That's part of the territory. But I would say that it has significant impacts, I believe, on a person's quality of life, and not, maybe not what we currently enjoy, but certainly what we could provide to our children and our grandchildren. I'm always struck by the fact that we travel the world as Canadian politicians, and I've done it myself as well, and we sign agreements to help advise, in this case we'll talk about oil and gas. We help advise on oil and gas, or we help develop the resources of oil and gas in a smaller country. And why is that? Because it's recognized that development of your natural resources will lift your people out of poverty. So doesn't the other side of it apply as well? That if you voluntarily decide that you're going to exit the development of your natural resources, that there's going to be some kind of an impact on you and on society around you, unless you have the vision to be able to transition smoothly, appropriately, and with great clarity on what you want to try to attach. So I think the chapter's not written yet, Ken, to be honest, but I think as long as we all have our eyes and ears open and we agree that oil, I think we have to agree that the world is going to need more energy, and that oil and gas development does help in terms of lifting people out of poverty. If we keep that in the top of our mind, and the rest will follow. Or maybe I'm too Pollyannish, but I still have optimism.
If I could just quickly add to it, in addition to the domestic considerations, I think we've made commitments and promises, while some of them maybe not legally binding, to some of our international partners on this pledge of where we can be in terms of energy security. So I think there's going to be consequences. As I said, there's a demand for Canada now. There's going to be a demand for Canada in 5 to 10 years. But we need to get this right. And I think there are a lot of our foreign friends who want us to get this right. But I think we need to be cognizant of some of the investments that some of our foreign friends have already made and the faith that they've kind of put in us in this sense.
Great, thanks. Any of the others there? Just a quick follow-up on that. I live in Saskatoon, and it's interesting, even in our neighborhood, you've had people who spent 10 or 15 years working in the oil sands area and building a really nice lifestyle for themselves, the 2 week in, 2 week out sort of model. Spent a lot of time in Fort McMurray, which is the single most misrepresented community in all of Canada. People who pass judgment on it have probably never been there. It's got a very strong sort of community sense and whatever. Those places are hurting. We've got people on our street who've lost their jobs, and they're now trying to sort of, had a nice high-paying job before, making over $100,000, and they're lucky to find a job at half that price, half that value coming in. And so the consequences sometimes are right on your street. And that applies all across the whole country, as you were pointing out about, Steve, the people from the Maritimes who come into that area. So Jeff, this is always one of the big puzzles for me. This is not a new industry. We didn't just create it last week. We've had an industry going for a very, very long time. Brian indicated that, we've got those good trade relations with the United States. I think we got a little lazy about counting on that market for so very long. We haven't, as you pointed out in a conversation with me, we haven't developed strong energy partnerships around the world. So why not? And what are we losing out? And again, in practical terms, I mean, is this, if we got this right, if we picked up on the Steve's suggestion and we actually ended up getting really good respect for our product and getting our product to market, what is the impact going to be on Canada? What are we leaving on the table?
Okay, so I guess first and foremost, the main reason why we haven't been so successful in striking meaningful energy cooperation agreements is because we don't have energy to sell to the Indo-Pacific. And I'm going to, again, focus on the Indo-Pacific here. Of course, virtually all, not all, but the vast majority of our exports now go south through existing pipelines into the United States. Some of that goes to the Gulf Coast and gets re-exported, but not really as Canadian resources. They're American exports. So we don't have, as you all know, we don't have capacity to export offshore. We have some. There have been a few small shipments to China. Last year there was a big increase from what it was before, which is almost none, but it's sort of been on a sporadic basis. Most of the crude oil that's coming through the existing TMX pipeline is going into Washington State to their refineries, and then some of it's being shipped down to California by tankers. So we haven't had the ability to get our products to market. And despite the fact that many of these countries, like Japan, they've been investors in the oil sands since the 1970s, and they've hung in. And then the Chinese have also hung in with their investments, despite the crash in oil prices and all the regulatory uncertainties and so on going on in Canada. They've held fast to those because I think they still want to believe that there's a future for Canadian resources coming to Asia. And don't be mistaken, they do want to bring crude oil and LNG to Asia to help improve their energy security. So, I think the Canadian government has tried to forge some energy cooperation agreements, places like Japan, South Korea, India, and so on. But they're more sort of focused right now on clean energy, so environmental technologies and so on. There's a real lack of focus on oil and gas. Probably could be explained by the fact we can't actually make any promises about getting oil and gas to the region, but they do have some agreements. But I think what I've been suggesting and others is that we need a strategic approach now, because we will have, and I'm very optimistic also about having capacity within the next 5 years to have significant exports to that region of both oil and gas. So we need to get started now in taking a strategic approach. And then I think we will have an opportunity to leverage Canada's resources in that region.
Super. Lovely to see Canadian optimists like this. This is sort of runs counter to our personality and character, but this is really quite delightful. So, Steve, I'm going to ask you the awkward question. I hope you don't find it too awkward, but the events of the last month or so have made very clear there's significant barriers to Canadian energy production and distribution. These have not been easy times, and there doesn't suggest there's an answer coming in the next 2 weeks or so. How are these barriers being viewed internationally? How do road blockades and protests that we're seeing sort of play out on the global scene? And how do we answer that? How do we give the kind of at least two optimists in a row talking about how we're going to break these barriers, we're going to make things work, and it's going to be able to export and expand our production? What does the world think about how we're handling this stuff?
Well, it's tough. I think different parts of the world think different things. There's some parts of the world that are very happy what we're doing here. Saudi Arabia, Russia, they're loving it. And but I think it's one of the great things about living in Canada is that you have a voice, you can protest, you can do all these things. And there's some downside when you get small minorities causing trouble, but I'll give you two stories. We have dealt with people in the Asia-Pacific, and they're incredulous. They can't actually believe that this actually happens, that you can't build a pipeline. That they just can't get their head around it. We also have had some American counterparts. And as you know, in Alberta has a cap on greenhouse gas emissions. We can't go above a cap, so there's a limit. Everybody thought there'd be unlimited growth, but there's a limit. You can only go so much greenhouse gas, 100 megatons, and that'll probably go down. One of our U.S. counterparts said, hey, we're getting to this agreement. We tried to, the industry and the government and the ENGO sort of brokered this deal. And one of the American counterparts said, I don't want this deal. I'm going to try to flip the table over and break it. And we said, well, we don't want you to break it, to get out if you're not going to be cooperative. And the reason they wanted to flip the table over is they got direction from the head office in the U.S. Don't let it happen in Canada, because as soon as you get it in Canada, you're going to come to the U.S. and they're going to try to do the same thing. So as long as we can keep them fighting in Canada, they'll stay away from us. So kind of a weird thing. So Canada's a great place to be because it's safe. We can all say what we want to say. Nothing's going to happen to you. That's not true everywhere else in the world. Other parts of the world can't understand why we just don't build a pipeline. Who cares about anything else? And that's not how we work here. So it's kind of a mixed bag, Ken.
Yeah, sounds like it. Any other quick comments on that? This is one of the hard ones. What do we do about this?
I will say one thing else.
Yep.
Add to that. If you look at the Fraser Institute, one of your colleagues, they did a study and they looked at investment in Canada since 2013 or 14 and how it's going. And they looked at investors from outside of Canada investing in, and they looked at Canadians investing out. And Canadians are investing out at a record rate. Canadians don't trust Canada anymore. They're getting out. Foreigners are getting out. So it's a $70 billion swing in investment from what we had in 2013 and 2014. That's not on all industries, just not oil and gas. This is everything. And I think my colleagues here down at the end probably will tell you, you can't go that long with losing $70 billion a year of investment and expect the economy to continue to roll along. It's been rolling along great, except for Alberta and Saskatchewan, but the rest, the economy's doing well. I don't think that's going to last if you have that kind of disinvestment, and that's a concern.
Okay, so we're not all optimists. When these things have to be addressed as well. So fortunately, we have a banker with almost 3 weeks of experience sitting with us sort of at the table.
Everyone at CIBC is now shaking.
So just to follow up, not to put you on the spot in this case at all, we still have a lot of major projects under consideration. And if you were to talk to groups like the Indian Resource Council West or the Project Reconciliation, they are talking about multi-billion dollar sort of projects that they want to get funding for. In the Coastal GasLink, we've heard a lot about the opposition to it. There was a serious effort being made back in November and December where a group of First Nations got together and were actually going to make they wanted to buy an extra 10-15% of the pipeline from what they currently have. As part of the negotiated arrangement, they have the right to buy a certain percentage. They were hoping to get even more out of this process. We didn't have a system in Canada for actually getting loan capacity in the hands of First Nations people. There's a 150-year history as to why we don't have that. But how do we maintain investor confidence? What's your answer back to Steve so when he hears these kinds of stories and people say we're losing our confidence in Canada? What's the answer, other than probably the most successful banking system in the world, which is a good starting point?
Yeah, that's a very multifaceted question. I would draw on my experience when I was still in government, and one of the projects that we had to do with selling Ridley Terminal out in BC, and this, thankfully, this Liberal government actually got it done and got into the hands. It was always a difficulty trying to ensure that there was appropriate Indigenous representation in one way or another, either trying to buy into the project, taking the whole project over, having the capacity to get into the project. And I think that is an area in which we are really evolving as it goes. And there is going to be a need for government awareness that you can't immediately become an entity that is going to be able to go out and borrow $100 million. And that's what is being experienced, I think, by a lot of First Nations in the country. So how they structure that will be very interesting, but I think it will come to its fruition in the Trans Mountain expansion. I think that is going to be the litmus test of how we move forward with these kinds of partnerships. And I do believe that these partnerships are absolutely fantastic. I think I agree fundamentally with what Steve said in terms of putting the power in people's hands in order to control their own destiny and create their own jobs. It's just remarkable, having skin in the game, right? That's what companies, in order to make sure companies are there, that's what you ask for. So from a CIBC banking perspective, I can tell you that Victor Dodig was one of the first, if not the first, president of a major bank that went out to Calgary after the election and talked about the importance of our family business. Our family business is oil and gas, and said that we're going to be there for oil and gas, and acknowledged that sustainable financing is incredibly important as well, but the two don't cancel each other out. They're actually quite knitted together. And keeping our eyes and ears on the ground and hoping that we can help facilitate however we can getting through the bumps. I mean, that's going to be a role for all of us in the financial sector and the banking sector as well. Cooler heads will prevail, and making sure that you help government understand what it is that needs to be done in order to ensure that appropriate financing is going to be available for these kinds of projects.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jeff, your turn to be stuck on the spot with a mean question. But we've heard the comments already that Asia is going to need, or could need, take advantage of oil and gas and energy products from sort of Canada. And ask the question in a somewhat long-winded way. The Canadian Embassy did a survey in Japan a while ago, probably 10 years ago, where they asked people what they thought of Canada as a country. And essentially it's moose mountains, you know, that kind of stuff, right? We spend a lot of money in Canada telling everybody we don't develop anything, you know, because you can always come to Banff and see the big mountains and all that kind of stuff. And it was really discouraging report because they didn't recognize the power of our urban centers. We have 4 of the top 20 cities in the world are actually Canadian cities, ranked in a whole bunch of different sort of areas. That isn't how Asia sees us at all. I'm not sure if it's how we see ourselves in that same sort of way. So I would also follow up by saying we're we're not very good in Canada at doing business in Asia. It's not an oil and gas issue. I guess I'm asking you this. I mean, what is how does Asia perceive us as a business partner generally, not just in oil and gas? And is there a good foundation for us becoming an energy superpower in Asia's eyes? Put it a somewhat different way.
Yes and yes. No, you make good points, and you're right very much that Canada's image in much of Asia is based on, you know, nature and natural resources. Travel is, you know, increased over the last, you know, decade or so from Asia to Canada, as we've all noticed, and that's great. And so, but when people come here, they're really looking for experiencing nature and going to the mountains, going to Niagara Falls, you know, and so on. So to some extent, I think it's generated, that impression generated from travel and their experiences in Canada, like others. But, you know, we haven't been aggressive marketers of some of our technologies. You look at a company like CAE, right? Even Canadians don't know what CAE does, you know. It's the global leader in airplane simulators. It's a very sophisticated technology, and they dominate the market globally. But you know, people in Asia aren't aware of that. People in Canada aren't really aware of it. So we're not very good at tooting our own horn, I guess, in many ways. I think Canadian government has made an attempt. They branded Canada, and they make attempts to improve that. But it's an upward battle. You need to do advertising. You need to do a lot of public relations and so on. I think, you know, it's starting to change. Resources, though, we have traditionally exported, most of our exports to the region have been natural resources. And so because those countries are so dependent on natural resources, people learn in school that we are dependent on countries like Canada for uranium, for, you know, coal, you know, for copper and aluminum and all these kinds of things that we export there. So as for oil and gas, and not only oil and gas, but uranium, and I would add the energy minerals, right, which we also have, and Lisa Raitt spoke about. Very important, also very strategic kind of resource. Canadian government started treating that resource in particular, rare earths that is, by aligning itself now with the U.S. through an initiative to counter China, which used basically trade in those fine rare earths against Japan a few years ago, if you may recall. So China dominates the market there. So we have an opportunity to be a player in rare earths as well, which is another kind of strategic energy resource. Likewise for these modular reactors. We have leading technology in modular reactors now. That could be a game changer for nuclear power in the future globally. But at this point, we're not really out there promoting it so much as, the technology is definitely moving forward. So there's a lot of potential in addition to our crude oil and LNG. There's a lot of potential, I think, as we get closer to the point where we're going to be exporting these products, which, as I say, will be probably in the next 5 years. I think we're going to see a lot more interest. And I think the Canadian government and provincial governments and others are going to need to do a lot more work in terms of educating and informing these countries and as our potential markets about the capabilities we have.
Great, thank you very much.
Just add a quick
John.
point on that. I mean, I do think there is still a bit of a questioning of purpose as Canadian businesses engage in Asia. But one kind of point that I think is important, I think this is a difficult cycle to gradually move away from, but from a diplomatic footprint. So whether it's trade commissioners or those who are there to assist our businesses overseas, this is something that Canada is still not quite caught up to. I think the changes that are happening in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific. So whether it's from a security perspective, transatlantic, or whether it's our former engagement in the Americas, it's not to say these regions are unimportant and that we need to vacate our missions overseas in these areas, but we do need to have a very cold, hard look at where our resources are based in Asia. And frankly, I don't think that we have that kind of proportion has been adequate to satisfy the point that you referenced. One other element that I don't think has been brought up yet today, and I think is very important, and especially why this time, and I think, Steve, as you referenced, we're in a time window that's very important now, is the TPP-11. So the CPTPP, I think, is an important kind of, it's not the end of the game, but the gates are now open. And I think it gives us our comparative advantage now in some of the states that we've referenced already today, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan. Effectively, we now have a free trade agreement with Japan. We already have a pre-existing free trade agreement with South Korea. So the time window is open, and it's not going to be there forever. As we've seen just last year with the U.S. Essentially forcing Japan to sign a free trade agreement, we're already losing some of our comparative advantage with vis-a-vis Japan on agriculture and other issues. So this is the window, this is the time window now that we have this very high threshold, high ambition trade agreement in the region to really push Canadian business, and energy would be one of those areas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one. And it's interesting to be a little bit critical of the Canadian business sector. We're not very good at this. We have very few people based over in those countries. We tend to hire local people to be our sort of facilitators rather than our own capacities. And I always use one example. There's currently 350 million people in China learning English. Tiny number of people in Canada who are not from Chinese Canadian families who are learning Mandarin or Cantonese. We're not developing the capacity to do much about that. Jeff?
Just a real quick one on that Jonathan mentioned. Canadian government, invested a tremendous amount of money and resources in opening up new consulates and trade offices across China over the last few years. But then we run into this current debacle with China, and all of a sudden now relations are in the deep freeze. At the same time they were doing that, they actually closed consulates and trade offices in Japan. But Japan is part of the CPTPP. We have access to that market. we have limited access to the Chinese market now. So I would say, you know, maybe we need to look at reallocating some resources here, because our future is maybe going to be a little less in China and a little more in some of the other countries we already have these agreements with.
Yeah, thank you. Steve, I always saved really easy ones for you. So that really enjoyed your presentation. If you asked most Canadians to answer the questions that you answered here, 95% of them will get it wrong about the efficiency and the effectiveness and the international markets and whatever. So let's assume for a second you gave that presentation on the steps of the BC legislature to the people who've assembled there on a regular basis. You can assume the response would not be very positive. How do we get Canada to a more balanced view? How do we get the story that you've shared with us today out there more generally so we have a reasoned debate as opposed to an emotional one?
I might actually do that Victoria thing if you could set it up. Because I'll tell you why. Because I think, you know, one of the ways to get out is, that's one reason we're talking here today, is trying to get the information, because everybody in the room here today is very influential. And you can talk and tell people about this thing. If you want to copy this thing, we'll send it to you. But you can send that message, and the more people you have talk about it, the better. And you're very influential people. You know, people trust you and believe you. So that's why we want to get the information to you. I'll also add, I'll tell you a story. Last week I was at the Globe 2020 conference in Vancouver. It's all about the energy transition, just economy, circular economy. You know, quite a bit of it is actually changing, I think, underneath it all, is changing, you know, the economic process towards more of a socialist view. And we had an opening session and had big-time speakers come up and talk at the very start of it. Minister Wilkinson was the last speaker. The other four speakers were all American, by the way, and basically telling us as Canadians what we needed to do and why we had to be renewables and why the world was going to end unless we did it. And it was very, very powerful. So when that's the first session, I thought, oh, this is going to be a tough thing, being an oil and gas guy in this crowd. And the more people I talked to in the sessions afterwards were not like that at all. They actually get that you have to have oil and gas. You have to do, as Lisa said, make this transition, make it thoughtfully. They recognize they need pipelines. And these were people who were in the clean tech business. They were pushing their products. They were really trying to do it. They understood that. But you don't see that from the people that made all the headlines. And I was telling Jen this earlier, that one of the speakers, awesome speaker, said, okay, everybody in the room who's 54 and under, stand up. I didn't get to stand up, by the way, but and they said, this is the way it works. The average age of life expectancy in Canada is 84. So in 30 years, you'll still be here. So they had a different way of saying it, but essentially, you're going to see the end of the world. And it was very dramatic. It was very influential. And I thought, well, I guess I'm not going to see the end of the world. That's too bad. But, you know, but when you actually went and talked to the people that are at the conference, the people that were trying to make a difference in the world, actually doing something about it, they have a different view. So I don't think we want to let that segment of the people up there saying the world's going to end drive all the public policy. Most people understand, as Lisa was talking about, there is a transition, it can be smart, and there is a place for oil and gas in the world. There's a place for nuclear in the world. A lot of people don't like nuclear. That's going to be a big thing.
Absolutely.
There's going to be a big, big place for renewables, and we have to make that happen, because really, if we're going to get all these people in the world out of poverty, we can't do it with oil and gas. For one thing, there's not enough of it, and the price will go too high. So if you look at globally, we want to have security in the world. The more people you get out of poverty, the better it is. So we need all this to happen, and they get that.
Excellent. Really, really interesting and sobering on the one hand, but optimistic sort of on the other. It's interesting, uranium. I think Saskatchewan produces 30% of the world's uranium, and it's very good, very high quality uranium. And that sector is in real trouble as well. because of global demands and prices and whatever. And I do a lot of work in Northwest Saskatchewan, a series of Métis and First Nations communities. They lost between 750 to 850 jobs last year through what hopefully a fairly temporary slow. It's been a year now, so it's not going to be all that temporary. The communities are reeling. What's really interesting is the rest of the country doesn't leap forward and make sure we provide opportunities in those areas. In the absence of uranium, there's nothing else sort of really going on. So thank you for that. This is going to be the last of my fixed questions.
Can I just
So,
ask you one?
absolutely.
When you say 750 jobs,
Yeah.
you know, in Ottawa or Toronto, that doesn't sound like a lot of jobs, but how big are those communities? Like, that's got to
Well,
be
the
a
largest
huge.
one's 1,500, 2,000 people.
So you think about,
It's
if I lose that
devastating.
many jobs, it's devastating.
Oh, absolutely right. They called us up as researchers to say, help us create the new economy. What does it look like beyond this, right? So thank you very, very much for that. I'm going to ask one last question to Jonathan, then turn it over to the group here, so he'll get your questions ready to go. I'll do that in just a minute. Jonathan, you made a really good case for, and you and Jeff and the others as well, the fact that this is a security issue. It is a question of sort of how our energy production fits into the global scenes and whatever. But ask you sort of a geopolitical question, and it's a simplification in one sense. I spent a lot of time in Norway, and Norway is a petrostate. It's a very smart petrostate. They've done a wonderful job of taking the government revenues, putting it aside. They've basically endowed their social programs for almost forever. I don't see anybody giving Norway a hard time. They're producing and exporting huge quantities of oil and gas. They're wonderful at that, and they do it very well in very dangerous settings in the high Arctic, right? This is not an easy place to do. Why does Canada get such critical attention? Because this is not just Canadian attention. We're getting a lot of pressure from the United States for reasons we've discussed a little bit, but I'll tell you, go to Australia or New Zealand or other places, and the first thing they'll say is, what's Trudeau done lately? And the second thing would be, and what about your industry? When are you shutting it down? I don't hear people talking that way about Norway, so I'm just intrigued with your thoughts about that.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a couple elements to it. I mean, I think obviously there's the domestic issues that I think some of them we addressed earlier today, that we're all very happy that we're here in Canada and that we have the rights and freedoms that we have here. But often it presents us with different landscapes than other countries. The second one, I think, very much dovetails with some of the issues we've talked about with our partners, whether they're in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere, is that the reason I think that we receive this critical attention, and some of this is frankly from our friends and allies, is because they want more of Canada. I think it's been a very good point that I think Stephen made and Jeff made also, that whether it's the Japanese, whether it's the Koreans or the Chinese, people have hung in with us. These investments have not been, in the energy sector, have not been things that have been 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Some of these have been decades long. So I think that there's a wariness. I think that there's some patience is running out, but there's a critical eye and a desire for Canada to come through on this. And I think one kind of last point I'd like to make, and just to kind of emphasize just how tense I think some of the situations globally are when it comes to energy security, is if you think last year after Christmas, and now it's hard to pinpoint any event in the geopolitical space as there's so much happening. But one incident that I thought was very intriguing was Russia, China, and Iran conducted naval exercises off the Gulf of Oman. And why I find this interesting is this kind of convergence between authoritarian powers. I use this just as one example. But if you look now, Russia and Turkey are the first ones heavily into Libya now and meddling in the Libyan civil war, an area with significant energy resources. We all know the story, obviously, in the Middle East and Syria with Russia and Iran's involvement in Iraq. So China in Africa effectively almost has bought that continent through shady deals and investment. Many energy sources there, such as Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and others. So we are facing a significant challenge of authoritarian countries essentially investing in these regions. Canada is an alternative that I think people want. And the reason why you're seeing these criticisms is I think that they're frustrated with the situation that we currently have.
Yes, please, Lisa.
So it's always it's bothered me. It's always bothered me what you said, which is true, which is the Netherlands and Norway and the Northern European countries always seem to be given a lot more latitude and leeway on an oil and gas industry that shares a lot of commonalities with ours. So I did a little research, and this is what I found out. What I found out is the actual ministries of foreign affairs for Norway and Germany were very active just after 2000 in setting out foreign policy that included research in renewables. And they basically cornered the market. So they got to it first, they did the development, their scholars got into the field, they wrote the scientific papers, they applied for the patents, and that gave them that kind of authenticity and that legitimacy in the field that allowed them to continue to do their oil and gas production, but at the same time talking about renewables. And I mentioned Mozambique before only because I'm fascinated by this project and what it possibly can do, given, and I understand the difficulties with corruption and piracy. But I mean, Norway's in there and they are advising them on oil and gas development. I mean, they're all over the place and there's no reason. We're late to the party. You can blame my former government if you want to for that time frame, but the reality is that you have to have vision going forward on where it needs to be, and I take the points really well about our consulates and where we need to be opening up and what we need to do and what research we have to do. So that, to me, is where I ended up on my little sidetrack on research of why them and not us.
Great. I thought it had to do with reindeer or something like that in Norway, so. Anyway, wonderful answers. We've got time for questions, and we actually have left a good portion of time for questions. So there's one here, then Jeff over there, and we've got lots of questions. So keep the questions short so we can get lots of answers. Yes?
Okay. Thank you very much for the enlightening presentation. I have a question regarding the climate change and our role in the climate change from the oil and gas point of view when we try to have our market open in China and India, and how that are we going to put some restriction and rules and policy on the use of energy, the proper use of energy in order to contribute in the climate change control. This is one question. The other question is what to do. You talk about the geopolitical situation around the world, but also what about the emerging infectious diseases that affect the economy and affect the global market, including like what we had in SARS a few years ago, and now the coronavirus in China that affected the economy and the price of oil and all of that stuff. So how is that counted?
Great, thank you very much.
Who's biting on that?
Who's going to jump on those ones?
So on the climate change one, I'm not sure I really understand your question. What are you saying? How China and India view climate change and the products, or?
China and India, they will not pay attention to climate change because they are rising. And when we talk to them about climate change, they will tell us that you have been developed, you have take your share in the world, and give us a chance to take our share in the world first, and then we'll talk about climate change.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I'm probably not the right person to answer that, but I would say I think you're seeing in China, at least, they're starting to see the pollution problems from coal. They're actually trying to make that transition. And I think somebody made the point that they're switching a lot of coal to gas and LNG. So they're not part of the Paris Accord. They get a free ride, so does India. But they're starting to see that, and so I think they'll see more of that. But you're right. They're only on price point. That's what they drive.
Yep.
But I'll let somebody else talk.
Well, I mean, I'll reference the coronavirus. I was just in Japan. I did not go on the cruise ship, but one kind of quick element of that. I mean, really, what we need is international cooperation. I mean, to look at to analyze where the markets will be and where energy demand will be in the next few months or 6 months. I'm not sure, but I think it is interesting to see. I mean, Japan being one of the elements of this, and South Korea and ASEAN as well. They're also interconnected now with the trade and travel with China. That this is clearly going to have an impact. I just, from a non-detailed perspective, noticed this when I was in Ginza, which is Japan's largest shopping district. Usually it's absolutely flooded with Chinese tourists. It was like a ghost town the past week. So we're going to see economic impacts that are going to have that kind of corollary effect on energy demand for sure. But the way to kind of work on that, I think, will be more international cooperation in the WHO and other areas.
Great, thanks. Really quickly.
Yeah, really quick on the coronavirus. The other thing that's been going on even before that is that supply chains are shifting in Asia now to the lesser developed countries, the emerging countries of Asia, because not just because of cheaper labor, but because as we've seen, when there is a virus or some kind of contagion, that can stop production of certain parts in China, which closes down the ability to deliver products all over the world. And so companies are realizing now, oh, you know, it's not just a cost issue, we also need to diversify our supply chain for these other reasons like potential risk from contagion.
Great, thank you. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Ken. You always accuse people of pessimism, so let me inject a bit of optimism. I was down in Cape Breton, Lisa, last summer giving a talk, and I was told by a number of people that there are 2 LNG projects on stream, on track in Nova Scotia. Pardon?
Yeah.
And that the Aboriginal people in that area are all on side.
Yes.
And regulatory approvals have been given, so it is possible in some parts of the country to get things done on an expeditious way. So cheer up on that. My question is this. That chart, Steve, that you showed, if you superimpose that on Canada, and you'd see people desirous of a big increase in renewables. Has anybody done any work in the universities or in the companies to indicate what the landscape, the physical landscape of Canada would be if you had tens of thousands of additional wind turbines, both onshore and offshore, to replace the energy that comes from fuels? Because where these are built in Canada, except the prairies, they have evinced a great deal of local questions. Let's be modest about it. If we were, for example, to go to 50% of our cars to be electrified by 2030, which is a target, a vast increase would be required of electricity. And people don't like big dams. They don't want any more nuclear plants. They're going to hate tens of thousands of additional turbines. Where's this going to come from without any public opposition, as it is to those renewable energy sources?
I don't have the answer to that question. I will say that you got those things right. It's going to take a tremendous investment. It's going to be good to be a banker, Lisa, because you're going to...
150 billion sustainable finance.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be good to be a banker. But the other thing people don't recognize is the grid is not built for it. So you can have all the renewable energy you want, but you also have to build the grid, because the grid is built for lighting, for your iPhone, for heating in some cases, but it's not built to charge your electric car. And so that means the grid's going to have to be a massive build-out. And there's somebody from the Manhattan Institute put out a study and said that to make that happen, not just the cars, just everything else electric, they would have to build out the grid faster than they have in the next 20 years than they have in the last 100 years in the U.S. So it's going to take a tremendous amount of work and capital investment. I guess that'll create lots of jobs, but somebody's got to pay for it. And that will go to the consumer at some point, unless the government pays for it, but then the government has to raise tax. So it's all going to go around. So it's going to be challenging. And I think that's why you want to have a very thoughtful, meaningful transition to try and shock it. We don't want to have the Cape Breton thing where you shut down the cod fishery and everything else that was poorly managed by the government of the day.
Thanks, Steve. Jeff?
Yeah, from sort of a technical point of view, I mean, solar really doesn't work in Canada because we don't have sufficient sunlight for long enough. Plus in the winter it's a problem because we don't get much sunlight at all. Wind only in certain places. Then you got to build the grid, as just was said. So some people will tell you, well, hydrogen, that's the answer. Well, you can produce hydrogen from LNG, and you can produce it from actually renewables, from wind or even solar through this process called electrolysis. And then you can produce the hydrogen, and then you have to transport the hydrogen all over the country and build a hydrogen infrastructure to fuel cars and all this stuff. So again, you come back to this huge investments in infrastructure, which will take decades, many, many decades. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Thomas Luke. I'm ambassador of Estonia, and I think that's why I was given the floor right now. Thank you very much indeed. But I think discussion is very interesting. So, and I think everybody is on the same line, basically. I very much agree that the world needs more Canada. So, and I was really, my first observation would have been that there is no discussion about Europe at all. I take, of course, that you're a specialist in Asia, but I think in terms of world needs more Canada, Europe is certainly important element. Also in terms of energy resources. And that reminds me of a story in Foreign Affairs 20 years ago. And there is an article about successful petrostates. And there is many states, but only one successful, Norway. So I was wondering, where is Canada? So where Canada has a lots of space in that respect. And the question, what to say to local council in BC? What would be your answer at local council in Nova Scotia? Because Nova Scotia has for instance, European policy. So what I want to say that in Europe you have certainly, from perspective of kind of globalist perspective and security perspective, certainly lots of understanding. So for me as an ambassador of Estonia, we see Canada as an ally, not only in NATO, why not also in energy terms? And if you recall, then President Trump said 3 weeks ago, that he would sanction all companies who would keep construction of Nord Stream. Next day, Swiss companies stopped construction. So there is a lot of political leverage also to Canada. But of course, I'd like to come to my question saying that there is opportunity. I think everybody understands that. Demand, that's also clear. And there is also a global perspective in terms of partnerships. For me as a foreigner would be, and I make a conclusion that this is a national interest of Canada. If this is correct, then I would ask when Canadian market is going to open up and what needs to be done in order to open it up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anybody with European comments?
Well, your hardest question is the when and what, but I do agree with you. I think that Europe is an area that we need to target as well. And looking at the infrastructure question, at least from a framework perspective, I think we're actually in a good space. So we spent a bit of time today talking about the TPP-11 or the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but actually we have a similar high ambition, high threshold agreement with Europe. So in addition to kind of the long-standing security ties, we have that framework for high sustainable trade. And kind of going to Stephen's presentation where he had the sustainable development goals and was listing the top goals, one of the positive things about frameworks like that and high ambition trade agreements like that is we fulfill those sustainable development goals within those. So I agree with you, it's a natural partnership. The trick is what it will take in the time frame, because I think we're going to face some of those same challenges that we've been facing with the Indo-Pacific that unfortunately are not that easy.
Great. So hands keep flying up over the place. We really want to get everybody a chance to sort of at least ask their questions. And actually, you people haven't got your hands up, so put your cell phones away and ask something. Just teasing. But what we'll do is give everybody like 30, 40 seconds just to sort of make your question. We'll collect a whole bunch of them and then sort of give you 30 seconds or so at the end, because we've only got 10 minutes left, so please. Sorry to not give everybody more chance.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. My name is Bob Lyman. 84% of the world's energy use right now is supplied by hydrocarbons. 4% is provided by renewables. Over the past decade, oil and gas have seen their fastest growth in energy consumption in history, and that trend shows no sign of declining. China and India together are massively building coal plants, and by 2030, some estimate that they will account for 50% of the world's GHG emissions. In that context, suggesting that we're making a rapid transition to decarbonized world, it seems to me is highly questionable and plays into the hands of the Greta Thunbergs of this world and of those in Canada who say that we cannot have any more projects, let alone more emissions intensive ones. How do we deal with that threat?
Great, thank you very much. Over here. The gentleman first and the lady afterwards right away. Thank you.
Yes, along with the last question, greenhouse gases require an enormous amount of fossil fuels to make them. In fact, Lisa said that the mining of the ore is a problem, but actually the mining of the ore is the most benign part of this process. Manufacturing these solar panels requires a huge amount of energy, and I doubt very much if over their lifetime they will reproduce the amount of energy that was expended in making them. This is very, very important, and you won't find that because China sells its energy for 1 cent per kilowatt hour, and here we pay 30 cents or 40 cents per kilowatt hour. That's not a good way to judge their performance. The other thing is that the per capita greenhouse gas for Canada is about 22 tons. For America, for the United States, is 20 tons. For the European Union, is 7.5 tons. For India, it is 3 tons. But this is not the proper metric. You have to multiply it by the population density to arrive at a figure that is reasonable. And if you do that, I work the maths for you. For Canada, is 83. For the United States, is 600. For the European Union, is over 1,000. For India, is over 1,000, in spite of the fact that India has the lowest per capita greenhouse gases. We must take that into account, and we must not be shamed into thinking that just because we have a high per capita greenhouse gases, that we are the culprits, we are the ones that are abusing the system. We must raise our heads high because Canada is probably the cleanest country in the developed world today, and we must emphasize that fact. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Isabel. I work with the Pembina Institute. And maybe a humble suggestion to the question, how can we engage into an honest conversation in Canada and talk to those folks who are saying no more fossil fuel projects? You know, the Pembina Institute has been identified in Alberta as the villain, and we're now, you know, unfortunately the enemy of the people. And my colleagues in Alberta are very concretely suffering from this and receiving threats. So I'd like to say, let's call out these undemocratic inquiries that are one-sided and that are actually hurting the quality of the debate. Pembina has a long history of working with the oil and gas industry and finding solutions. Let's work together. I really invite you to get in touch with organizations. Let's host some Alberta roundtables on the economy and the environment. Let's define those pathways to net zero and define the role of oil, define the role of gas by really, we all have a role to play in depolarizing this conversation and protecting our democratic processes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Question over here, and then we'll bring the microphone down this direction. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Philip Schubert. I'm an energy economist working with developing countries, and I just start by pointing out there are a billion people in the world who still have no access to electricity. My question is really for Steve. I was very pleased to hear how your company and other companies like you are bringing the emissions released in the production of oil and natural gas and probably also coal, not your company, down to low percentages and through carbon capture and sequestration, et cetera. But in fact, you can correct me on this in terms of percentages, but about 5% of the emissions are in the production of natural gas, oil, and coal, and about 95% is actually in burning it, using it by the consumers, whether they're in Canada or overseas. And so the challenge really, it's great that Canada can get its emissions down, you know, in the production of this, but of course the 95% of the emissions are still happening by those who consume it. And what is your thinking in terms of your image of the world, vision forward, in terms of that 95%.
Great, thanks. One question over here. And then we'll turn it back to the panelists. You're going to have about a minute each to sort of come up with an answer to all of those questions simultaneously. Thank you.
Energy return on energy invested. We all know that energy is the lifeblood of an economy. Too expensive, the economy goes off the cliff. This is what happened in 2007, 2008, and brought us the Great Recession. Not by itself, obviously, but it was a big trigger. Cheap enough and plentiful enough, it is the mother's milk of everything, including, conspicuously, innovation. Coal gave us the steam engine, and steel, and ultimately the railway system. Oil, Texas oil gushers, enabled, facilitated, torqued the internal combustion engine, gave us the highway system, gave us 3-car garages, you name it. Then we went on to the internet with everything that electricity did for us. That's the result of cheap energy. So my question is, where are we now in terms of energy invested on energy returned with all of the various options we have available to us?
Great, thank you. Obviously, we could have had this conversation way much longer. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. And we're going to go back this way, so I'm going to ask Jonathan first for just any final comments, answering some of the questions if you can, but you might talk to folks afterwards and come back this way towards Steve.
Yeah, well, I won't take very long, but the last kind of comment makes me think about the definition that I originally referenced on energy security. And I think that kind of brings it home. I mean, there's three, you could probably use more adjectives, but really what we're looking at is affordable, something that's sustainable, and something that's unencumbered. That mix, whether that, we talked about some renewables, we talked about a number of different energy sources and some of the challenges, the infrastructure challenges, the grid challenges. So that mix, getting that mix right is not easy. But I think some of the discussions today really focus that we do have a future, we have a history, we have an advantage when it comes to oil and gas, and I think that we shouldn't be ashamed to use that.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
I'll answer the last question because that's the only one I remember now. But so energy return for energy invested, that's a pretty easy answer. Energy efficiency, absolutely hands down. A little bit of investment in reducing the way we use energy is going to have the biggest contribution to reducing greenhouse gases, bar none. And we can do that in so many ways: more efficient cars, more efficient machinery, looking at how our cities are designed, mass transit, roadways, all those kinds of things, insulation in houses in Canada and so on. All those things can make the biggest difference for money invested.
Thanks, Jeff. Lisa?
Thanks very much, Ken. I wrote down all the questions and I have them here, and the theme that comes out of them is kind of sort of what you said in your first question to me at the beginning was, what happens if we don't get it right? And the kinds of things that we brought up in terms of making sure we don't fall into the trap of transitioning too quickly, and how do we have an honest conversation and recognition of the importance of energy. I mean, the reality is that politicians and bankers and resource companies and miners and academics, everyone has to really be on the same page and try to communicate this in a sensible way. And the problem is politics, right? That's the problem. And I'll tell you, I went through the last election in 2019. I did not win my seat. I will tell you that in the 5 debates that I had locally, even if they were an agricultural debate or the Chamber of Commerce debate, the #1 issue that came up was about environmental plans and what we were going to do for the environment. And there was no getting away from that spotlight and that filter of the way in which we had to look at energy, which was energy production is negative unless it's the right kind of energy, and we don't really know which energy is the best energy, given the reasons you gave about solar and windmills and how do you dispose of windmills after they've been there for a long period of time. So I'm not as optimistic now as I was at the beginning of this panel, but because it comes down to politicians who do have a large microphone and the national stage to work across the aisle with each other to try to get this vision part right and be helped by folks like Steve from oil and gas, who can come in and give a good education and not put blinders up and always listen, I think, is the way forward, because Ottawa tends to close their ears if they don't want to hear the message, and we have to encourage our politicians and our public officials to have courage and listen to both sides.
Yep, thank you. I always, when students at university sort of ask, what do we need to get things going forward? And I always say the human characteristic in shorter supply is courage. The willingness to stand up, have the kind of conversations we talked about. The Pembina Institute were very important. Steve, you had the first word. You get the last one. Keep it short.
I'll be short. I'll answer 2 questions. One you answered directly to me, and I'm an engineer, so I'm going to give myself license to talk technology because I love this stuff. But it's actually 12% was from production. The rest is consumption, and that's the big thing. So nobody. And that's part of the politics. Nobody wants the consumer to actually have to pay for this. because you're going to lose votes. So they don't want to do that. But one of the things that technology we're working on is called molten carbonate fuel cells. So what you do is you take flue gas, could be from coal, could be from natural gas, generating electricity. You run it through with natural gas and air. It produces electricity and decarbonized flue gas. So this is a way to use the infrastructure we have to generate more electricity and decarbonize. So that's good for the consumer. They don't have to, energy efficiency is a big thing, but they don't have to sacrifice anything. And the Pembina comment, I totally get that. I think partly it's the world we live in with social media and the media. They want a headline. So they probably take some of the things you say at Pembina out of context and try to create a headline. We're used to that in the oil and gas business. It's always to create a headline. And I think we got to work together, as you say, work together to come to an answer for everybody here, because it's not going to be one single silver bullet. We all have to work together across the board to make this happen.
Well, listen, thank you all for coming today. Wonderful group and wonderful questions. We could have done this for a much longer time, and I apologize we couldn't get more in. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists, Lisa, Rayed, Jeff Kasharsky, Steve, Jonathan. Absolutely wonderful. This kind of a discussion and debate here today is precisely what Macdonald-Laurier Institute was created to do. Bring the issues of greatest importance out in the public and get people's feedback and response, and try to come up with thoughtful sort of solutions. So extend my thanks as well to Brian Lee Crowley, David Watson, and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute staff for sort of putting this event on and arranging for all of you to be here. I appreciate that. To our sponsors, Canadian Natural and CIBC, we need that support in order to make these things happen on a regular basis. Let's make sure that we take the ideas, the suggestions, the conflicts in our way of approaching forward, and actually make sure that we share these as widely as we possibly can. You've been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for coming.